Hello, students. This is Mr. Archibald coming at you for protesting the Vietnam War by the anti-war movement. We're going to start talking about first the origins of the peace symbol. Started by Gerald Holtram in England in 1958. It is, interestingly, and I did not know this, the letters for ND in semaphore. Semaphore is a system of using flags to spell out letters to communicate over vast distances from ship to ship or across the battlefield. N is two flags held at an upside down V, and D is two flags standing straight up, one up and one down. Superimpose those, and you have the round circle with the inverted V and the straight line making the peace symbol. The anti-war movement in the United States made good use of the peace symbol and made it their basically call sign for the entirety of the peace movement. Another key factor in the anti-war movement was the formation of the SDS, which is the Students for Democratic Societies. SDS quickly became the main anti-war organization with groups in almost every college campus. Now, resistance before the war, before the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, was largely limited to people who were pacifist. People like Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, and Phil Oakes were folk singers who basically spoke out against the Vietnam War, spoke out against all war, not the Vietnam War in particular. But after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, you have lots of other people coming to the anti-war side. These are people who have differing reasons. They find the war immoral, or they find it unjust, or they find something they don't like about the war. Maybe it's the draft. Maybe it is the larger number of civilian deaths. Maybe it's the anti-imperialist position. The idea the United States is not there to combat communism, but is instead there to carve out a colony in Southeast Asia. And for others, it was the media coverage, the changing media coverage, especially after the Tet Offensive, that changed the way they perceived the war and the way they acted about the war. Following the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, you have some of the first movements against the war in teach-ins. First one at University of Michigan. Basically, classes were canceled, and they had basically a large seminar type thing where they had some outside speakers, but they basically let everybody speak, and there was no time limit, and it went on late into the night, and it was very popular, and there were a lot of people that enjoyed it, a lot of people liked it, and so it was replicated in a lot of other places, at least 38 other universities across the United States in 1965. The resisting the draft became a much more prevalent thing. Draft dodgers, as they were called, fled to Canada. They burnt their draft cards. They organized public rallies protesting the Vietnam War. And many of them were organized by SDS, the Students for Democratic Society. A more radical form of protest, self-immolation, taking as their example, the Buddhist monk who set himself on fire protesting Diem's policies in 1963. You have Americans who did the same thing. Pacifist Alice Hertz was the first one in 1965. She was 82, and she set herself on fire in Detroit. A passing motorist saw her, put her out, and then she died later in the hospital. But in total, 9 Americans would, over the course of the Vietnam War, engage in self-immolation, some of them to varying degrees of success. Most of them died. The fact that 9 Americans were willing to do that says something about people's position in the Vietnam War. And in case you were asking, the Vietnam War is not the only time Americans have burned themselves to death in protesting. Both Gulf Wars had someone who burnt themselves to death, which was news to me because I have lived through both Gulf Wars and I don't remember any of the media coverage on that. It was just one person each time. So the fact that there's 9 people here during Vietnam might say something, but anyway, there's a dedicated group of people out there who are very pacifist and are willing to burn themselves to death for it. Veterans also got into the anti-war rally. This anti-war rally in 1966 is pretty famous. For one, this is the one where many of them took their medals and threw them away because of their frustration over the war. It was a very powerful symbol. The fact that many of them were willing to take their Purple Hearts and Silver Stars and whatnot and toss them away in protest of the Vietnam War. Discharged separation papers were burned, which is a crime. Burning a draft card is a crime. Burning your separation papers, that's nothing. So it was, but you can see here that even as early as 1966, the war is beginning to gather some significant momentum against it. Public anti-war sentiment continues to drop as early as 1965. You have people focusing on the war as the #1 issue. And you can see here on this graph how it goes from 70% and starts to slip down as far as Johnson's support, the support for Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War. See, it peaks there in certain places, but it also bottoms out there, the Tet Offensive, the violence of the Democratic Convention, etc. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, speaks out in 1967 and in 1968 before he was shot. He envisioned the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement joining together because he saw these things locked, that the war was a civil rights issue because it disproportionately impacted the poor, and the African American population makes up a significant portion of those poor. The security we profess to seek in foreign adventures we will lose in our decaying cities. The bombs at Vietnam explode at home. They destroy the hopes and possibilities for a decent America. Martin Luther King Jr., 1966. All right, the anti-war movement. There's to say there's one big anti-war movement it's a misnomer. There's no one organization. I mean, SDS is organizing a lot, but they're not the only one. Many times it's just colleges taking it upon themselves. The University of Washington protest Dow. They didn't want Dow to come to a jobs corporate recruiting fair. The reason being, Dow is one of the chemical companies that produce both napalm and Agent Orange. And so a riot ensued. 65 students and 3 police officers were injured, but Dow Chemicals was banned from the campus. One of the things you hear a lot as the war progressive is speaking about the gaps. Following the Tet Offensive, there were a growing number of people who used the word gaps. For instance, the credibility gap. LBJ campaigned as a peace candidate in 1964. But the war continued to escalate under him, and so his credibility, the standard by which people believe what he says, becomes wider and wider. And there are a lot of people that do not believe LBJ, anything he says towards the end. Communication gap, obviously, between those who supported the war and those who were against the war. You can see this a lot today when we talk about the Democrats and Republicans. We have Republicans who are not willing to listen or hear anything that a Democrat has to say, and vice versa. And so you had anti-war protesters who saw people who supported the war as brainwashed sheep, and you had people who supported the war seeing the anti-war protesters as crazy liberals who are, more communist than anything else. The anti-war protesters had a cause to rally around, the being against the war. The pro-war testers did not have as much, but they gained somebody to kind of give momentum to their movement in Nixon when he ran in '68. Also, you have the generation gap because it seems like it's the younger generation that's more against the war and the older generation that's supporting the war. And so you have this huge generation gap between the greatest generation, the World War II generation, and the baby boomers, um, because of this. And because of this generation gap, you have what we call the counterculture of the 1960s. Part of this generation gap, this counterculture was, basically everything that Teenage Rebellion is. Only this time you had the fuel of the Vietnam War thrown onto it, and so it was basically a huge situation, a very different situation growing up than any other generation has had. They challenged conventional social norms, embracing sex, drugs, rock and roll. They were called hippies, flower children. They weren't support a surprising number of academics, but they were basically ridiculed by the mainstream and middle America. That was, of course, until Woodstock. There are a lot of good documentaries about Woodstock. There's a good one on Netflix I would recommend you watching. Get your parents' permission, of course, first, because there is a little bit of R-rated material in there. But you have, almost 500,000 people descending on a dairy farm in upstate New York. They didn't have a place to park, so they had to park along the road. There were cars parked along the road for miles. I'm talking like 7, 8, 9 miles down the road. People parking and then walking. They sold tickets to the festival, but because they had to change locations at the last minute, they did not have enough time to build the stage and build a fence. So since there was no fence, there was no way to keep people from just walking into the grounds. And so it became pretty apparent there was going to be no way for them to collect people's money for the concert at the door. And so they basically made it a free concert. And the people that hosted the concert basically lost a lot of money. But what they did have here is a time where you had 500,000 people gathered together for 3 days of music in upstate New York, and not a single violent crime occurred. There was virtually no need for security. It was basically the definition of a peaceful event, and brought together some of the greatest rock, greatest music of the generation in one great, fantastic show. That being said, you have the flower children, the anti-war, the young people, the people that are they don't know any better. And then the middle America, they are called the silent majority, because inevitably, as more and more people resist the war, you're going to have the people that support the war get this backlash movement going on, this anti-war movement. The pro-war people were called hawks. The anti-war people were called doves. And they rallied around Richard Nixon, and President Nixon claimed in November 1969 speech that anti-war protesters constituted merely a small but vocal minority that was attempting to drown out what he called the silent majority. And so those who supported war were often given the label of silent majority. And to a certain extent, it was true. Even as late as 1968, there was still a majority of the people that supported the war. Now that starts to drop off significantly in 1969, 1970, 1971, and where it becomes quite apparent pretty soon that almost everybody is starting to really gear up and be against the war. That's at the point where you have middle America joining in. Up to that point, it was just the academics and the younger generation. You also have increasing radicalization, though, which threatens to drive the supporters of the war to basically double down on their support. When you have people When you have people that engage in radical actions, well, it does not bring credibility to your cause. And one of those groups was called the Weather Underground Organization, or the Weathermen. They were an offshoot of SDS, and they basically declared war on the United States government. Three of their members were killed in an accidental bomb explosion. They were making bombs, and this made national news because it was right in New York City, in the Greenwich Village, New York City. But other bombings were successful. For instance, they bombed the U.S. Capitol building and the Pentagon. No one was killed in either of those bombings, but the Pentagon bombing was, I mean, it blew up, set off the fire suppression system, and it caused them to lose lots of classified data inside the Pentagon. But these radical tactics did not do anything to win over supporters. In fact, they had members of the anti-war movement denouncing them. And eventually, by 77, all of the weathermen are caught, or they just basically give up. So, impacts of the anti-war movement. It largely exposed the class tensions within the United States. You have the differences between the poor and the rich. Ironically, it was the well-to-do young Americans in college that were the least likely to be drafted for war, but they were the ones that were most vocal against it. Some went to great lengths to avoid the draft, but those who were drafted could often parlay typing skills or business courses into safe rear guard assignments, basically assignments in supply depots far away from the front line. But it was the younger people from lower middle class and lower class families that made up the vast majority of the soldiers who actually did the fighting in Vietnam. And this meant that there was a large portion of these were Latinos and African Americans and other minorities. It was basically seen as a working class war. Now, 1969, Nixon decides to invade or bomb Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is in Cambodia and in Laos, and it delivers items to South Vietnam by basically going around the borders. They'd been doing this since the beginning of the war, and so Nixon says, I'm done with it, and starts bombing into Cambodia and into Laos to blow up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Later on, he decides to invade Cambodia. And this sparks one of the most infamous riots and most infamous protests in all of the Vietnam anti-war history, the Kent State Riots. They began with Nixon's announcement on April 30th that he would be sending troops into Cambodia. Basically, we are going to invade Cambodia to defeat North Vietnamese bases that were based in Cambodia. The students at Kent State and other places protested this. The next day was Friday, May 1st, and that night they all went to the bar, started drinking, getting drunk, and rowdy, and they had a spontaneous anti-war rally / riot in the streets, throwing bottles at cop cars, etc. That night, things progressed, gets progressively worse. They start to riot down through town, targeting political buildings such as banks, loan companies, utility companies, etc. Later that night, the mayor is briefed, and he reads in the riot act, and the troops dispersed many of the students back to campus. About 14 people were arrested. About $5,000 of damage was done that night, mostly broken windows. The next day, things get a little more heated. They surround the ROTC building on campus, which is an old wooden World War II barracks, basically designed for World War II type things, and was scheduled to be demolished, and they set it on fire. The firemen arrive, they slashed the hoses, attacked the firemen, and then the blaze quickly died out anyway. They light it again. This time the firemen come, but with massive police protection, and they are able to disperse the crowd. Fireman gets the fire under control. May 3rd was a quiet day. May 4th was a Monday. Campus is back in session. People are getting ready for finals. And there is a protest going on in the campus. Classes resume, etc. But there's an anti-war protest scheduled around noon. The National Guard's called out. The governor of Ohio is cognizant of the damage in they're near Kent State, and so he sends in the National Guard. You have National Guardsmen there trying to keep order. They fire tear gas, but because of the wind, it's ineffective. And so they begin to escalate. They begin to get more aggressive. They begin to try to force the crowd to disperse. I said the tear gas is not as effective. And the real interesting thing is there are people that are protesting, and there are people that are just there going to school, ignoring the situation. Things escalate until finally 29 of the soldiers, fearing for their lives, supposedly, they open fire, and they fire into the crowd. Eventually, up to 77 guardsmen advance on the protesters with armed rifles and bayonets, and there are 67 shots total fired in the span of 13 seconds, I believe. There are fatalities. The two of the students who actually died hadn't even participated in the riots. They were just walking in between classes. 4 died. 9 were wounded. And that is the Kent State Massacre. National Guard troops firing into Kent State students for killing 4 and wounding several others. It is investigated, and obviously Kent State marks a turning point in the war. Prior to this, you could say that there were a majority of the people that still supported war. After this, it was it took the wind out of a sail, a lot of people supporting the war. And people begin to wonder what's going wrong with America. Why are American troops firing on American college students here on American soil? One of the other regrettable aspects of the anti-war movement is the anger at the military. Massacres such as the My Lai and the court-martial of William Calley, who basically was sentenced to life but was later paroled after only 3.5 years. A series of congressional hearings that same year, and several soldiers confess or anonymously admit that they also engaged or they had witnessed several other war crimes going on throughout the war. And so this caused a lot of people to react in anger at the members of the military. You're talking about people who had been drafted to go, or largely people who had been drafted to go. So they had no choice, or they had a choice, but they chose to fight in the war rather than to dodge the draft. And so you have stories of Americans calling these soldiers baby killers, spitting on men in uniform as they come home. It's a very ugly situation. To add insult to injury, in 1972, you have people like Jane Fonda, who was a well-known actress, a famous actress at that time, who made a trip to North Vietnam to denounce U.S. military actions, condemning U.S. soldiers as war criminals. She became known as Hanoi Jane, and it made so many Americans angry. She paid a huge price for this, and she didn't make it into very many movies after this. Jane Fonda here on a NVA anti-aircraft gun. Yes, an anti-aircraft gun that would be used to shoot down American pilots. Here she is applauding said anti-aircraft gun and its crew. She called POWs who returned liars and hypocrites, basically saying that they hadn't been tortured, they hadn't been starved, they hadn't been brainwashed. All the while, you have people like, John McCain, who would later become a senator from Arizona, coming back on crutches because he had been suspended by his arms so often he could no longer lift his shoulders up above his up even with his head. They had caused so much damage to the joints and the ligaments inside his arms. One good thing that did come out of the anti-war movement, aside from the ending of the war, was the 26th Amendment. Prior to this, you had to be 21 years old to vote, but many people realized that it's not right to be sending someone to war without letting them have a say on who the politicians are who sends them to war. You could be drafted at 18, and you could go fight for your country, but you couldn't drink alcohol, and you could not vote on that situation. So, 26th Amendment passed in 1971 changed all that. So, that is the the anti-war movement. So, I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you're having a great break. And I look forward to seeing your assignments.